There are going to be slides today, like I said. They're going to have pictures of ghosts and goblins and all kinds of Halloween-y types of things, including kids in costumes. So I want to talk about fears today. It's an interesting part of our culture that we have an interest in things that scare us. There is an industry in our country for horror films, and the most recent data I had was back to 2012, so forgive me, but back in 2012, $413 million was made from horror movies. $413 million. That's a lot of money that people are paying to be afraid, to be scared out of their wits. To go see Jason with his his machete, To go see Hannibal Lecter terrorize us in some fashion. People pay for this. Just think about that for a minute. We also get on roller coasters, right? And we hop on the roller coaster, go up and down. I don't. Other people do that. Take you spinning down to your death or seeming. So we kind of like this exhilaration, this near-death feeling to experience. People pay for this. Theme parks, all about scaring you to the point where you'll pay the money. We dress up at Halloween. We like that feeling of leaving the movie theater maybe and knowing that it's all just make-believe. I don't know. Why do we put ourselves through that? But why do we make believe in fear? We dress up Halloween, and skeleton ghost images decorate homes. Kids put on a sheet, poke a couple of little holes in the eyeballs to see out. We go around and pretend like we're ghosts. We have fascinations with these sorts of things, right? There's a holiday about death and fear. Mexico has it too, right? I mean, isn't that what Cinco de Mayo is? No. Cinco de Mayo a little bit? No? You gotta know how that one, right? Okay, sorry, they have another one. Okay, sure. So anyway, fear, all kinds of cultures have fears and things about what's out there. We do crazy things. Halloween time, you keep your black cat kept inside, I'm told. Nita's brother had his black cat kidnapped for 3 weeks for Halloween. People do crazy things at Halloween. We fear the unknown, and sometimes we fear what we know as well. All those kinds of things. And yet, we relish it a little bit. We also know to stay away from the things that we fear. And maybe it helps us to remember to stay away from things by fearing them, by thinking about them a little bit and knowing we don't want any part of that. I don't know. We're going to take a look at Colossians today. And in Colossians, it talks about some things which I know people fear, or it talks about some things that maybe we should fear. People fear the ghosts and goblins kind of stuff in our world. And verse 6, Colossians 2, Paul writes, "Therefore, as you have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, having been firmly rooted and now being built up in him and established in your faith, just as you were instructed, and overflowing with gratitude. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of this world, rather than according to Christ. For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and in him you have been made complete. He is the head over all rule and authority, and in him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body and of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. Having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, He made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us. And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. And when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Paul writes here about some of the things that are dangerous in the world. He tells us how to live. He says, keep living in him. Now we kind of got to explain that. What does it mean to keep living in him? Because we have all these options to choose from. We can live in him, or we can choose something else, something less. It's a choice we make every day. Sometimes we think about it, sometimes we don't think about it. But we choose less all the time, unfortunately. A lot of people do. We call that choice sin. And among other things, sin is choosing something lesser than God. Sometimes it's an untrue thing. Sometimes it's a thing that replaces God in some fashion in our minds or in our hearts. Sometimes people choose something without realizing it, like when the Pharisees chose their own set of rules and regulations that they'd set up instead of following God's ways, instead of following his law. In order to be safe, they designed a bunch of rules that removed any chance for them to sin. And in so doing, Jesus says, they endangered themselves. It's kind of weird, isn't it? The way that played out. That's what Paul's talking about here when he talks about choosing lesser things, I think. Things that take people captive. He talks about hollow and deceptive philosophy that people are teaching. Now, when people talk about scary religious ideas, I think they like to think about demons and devils and powers of the spiritual realm. And the world is filled with scary powers. But one nice thing that Paul says here to the Colossians is our God has promised to protect us from those forces. Jesus came along casting out demons. He came along overcoming the powers beyond us, the things that we were frightened of. And by belonging to him, the powers and forces of evil, the demons and the spirits of the netherworld, they don't hold any power over a man or woman who belongs to Christ. Paul reassures us when he reminds us that Christ is the head over every power and authority. And that's whether you're talking about ones you can't see or whether the ones you're seeing around you. And so we have nothing to fear from those forces as long as we don't play with them or dabble with them or invite them in. We're protected, in other words, as long as we want to be protected. I hear about Christians talking about how scary Satan can be. And he can be, and his demons, his forces can be scary if you play their game, but you have a choice. And if you belong to Christ, you have chosen not to play. It's not the demons of the world that you need to fear. When Paul writes, it's your choices that get you into trouble. So when Paul speaks here about being taken captive, he doesn't talk about Satan. He isn't talking about demons or spirits. He's talking about people and their choices. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy. Philosophies aren't invincible superpowers that we can't possibly defeat. Instead, they are human traditions, he says, and basic principles of this world. It's the phrase he uses there in verse 8. Normal stuff, human traditions, basic principles of this world. He says, look out for those things. It all goes into what Paul has in mind when he talks about human tradition and basic principles of this world. How can that stuff be scary? It's like when somebody says things like, God helps those who help themselves. Everybody heard of that one, right? It's in the Bible?
Nope.
Nowhere. Sounds like a great saying, though, isn't it? Maybe there's truth to it. I don't know. We like to think it comes from the Bible, but it doesn't. Do you know what its origin is? I looked it up on the internet. Greek fables. Greek fables. Talking about the gods of Olympus. And there it was, the gods help those who help themselves. Interesting how that's crept into our culture in various ways. And we've kind of thought of it as a biblical principle or a godly principle at times. Or people say things like cleanliness is next to godliness. In the Bible? No. Pardon me? Ben Franklin? I don't know. I didn't look that one up, I have to admit. It's maybe what we like to think, but it's not what God thinks. I think it might be Ben Franklin. I don't know. But people go along sometimes enforcing cleanliness on others in one fashion or another, perhaps, because they like the principle, right? And takes us away from thinking about what God has told us to avoid or to do. We replace sometimes neat-sounding ideas and principles that we've come up with, and sometimes we make them rules in our minds that we either live by or we make other people live by. Money is the root of all evil. Is that in the Bible? The love of money is the root of all evil. It gets messed up sometimes by people. I made that mistake at one point too, thinking, yeah, that's in the Bible. It's in 1 Timothy 6:10. Well, it's in the Bible, but it's in the Bible as the love of money is the root of all evil. And when you kick out a couple of words, a lot of times what happens is people then like, oh, rich people are bad. Becomes the conclusion, right? If you mess up what's written and change God's rules or laws or commands or ideas into something different, you have something lesser. You have a human tradition, an interesting philosophy, but it's not God's principle. When you change God's ways, when you add something that sounds like God, you change the message, and maybe you only change it slightly. But when you change it slightly, it's no longer His message. God gives us the message He wants us to have because it puts us on the track, on the way that He wants us to live. People have always done that, though, right? That we fear the wrong things, so we make up rules to feel safer. Pharisees didn't like the ambiguity of keeping the Sabbath, so they made up rules like how far you could walk, exactly the kinds of things you could do, whether you could get your ox out of a ditch on the Sabbath became a really big deal to them. Jesus came along and was like, this really isn't that complicated, guys. It's good to do good things on the Sabbath. Your ox falls into the ditch, get him out. It's those human traditions that we need to fear. And it isn't easy to spot them sometimes when we're doing them. It's easy to point them out when other people are doing them. That seems to be the really great achievement of our culture, is we can look over at other people, right? And we can see what they're doing wrong. That's the great achievement of life. Paul says, when God made you alive with Christ, He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the written code with its regulations and nailed it to the cross. And what do people do? We like to pull out those old regulations and write up new ones that God may have missed. Right? And we create the same problem all over again. A lot of people say, well, this passage is talking about the Old Testament regulations. That's true, but you can dig things up and create a whole new set of regulations and recreate the same problem all over again. So Paul goes on, in case we weren't sure about what he's talking about. Verse 16. Paul says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. But the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of angels, taking a stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with a growth which is from God. If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which refer to the things destined to perish with use in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men? These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. So you look at that list, you might wonder, what is he talking about there? I mean, in modern time, you look back at that list and the things which he's talking about, it may not be immediately obvious what Paul's getting at, but he gets very specific here. Don't let anyone judge you, he starts off saying. That's his concern. Rather than defining what's right and wrong, he says, don't let anyone judge you about these things. And he starts listing those things off. It's hard to do. People judge us all the time. Paul isn't saying that you shouldn't judge immoral behavior. So we don't want to misuse the scripture. In Corinthians, in his letters, he talks about Christians judging the immoral behavior in their midst and saying they're qualified to do so and need to do so. I see people misusing sometimes the idea of, oh, you're not supposed to judge. Well, it's not what Paul's talking about just over across the board here. He says put an end to immorality. But here he has a different problem. People in the church are judging what others eat or drink. You go on the internet and you can read a ton of opinions about what to eat or drink. Drink 8 glasses of water per day. It's one of my favorites. Doctors say that's not really needed. Don't eat meat. Don't eat white rice. Don't drink wine. We've got a whole list of all these things, and people apply them not only about what's best for your health, they apply them in religious ways sometimes as well. We make up these rules about what to do, what not to do. We love to make up rules. Don't let people judge you, Paul says, over those things. And he goes on. And don't let them judge you over religious festivals either. He's probably talking there about the Old Testament festivals that were practiced at that time around Pentecost and all those kinds of festivals that they had as Jews. But it's funny, we didn't introduce sometimes judgments about modern Christian religious festivals, as if that's okay to judge people on, even though God has said nothing about those things. Or Sabbath day, he says. Don't let anyone judge you over that. Why would he say that? Because some of the people were Jewish, some of the people were not. Some of them recognized the Sabbath day and some of them did not. Somebody in modern times recognizes the Sabbath day. Can you judge them? We're told very specifically here, you can't. First of all, it's serious business to allow someone to judge you about the things God hasn't said. If someone presses rules on you and you agree to the rules, and then you break them, you're guilty before God. Because you said you were going to keep the rules and you didn't. Part of Paul's argument there that he makes with regard to the law and circumcision. He says, don't bind yourself again under a new set of rules or an old set of rules, because if you do so, you better be faithful to those rules. But you've been given a gift through Christ. You've been given salvation that's separated you from a law of regulations, and instead given you a relationship with God where you can seek out and do the right thing. He says people who spread these rules will often pretend to be nothing more than human, humble servants of God trying to help you. He talks about false humility in here. Notice that? They'll come along with their philosophical teachings, he says, with false humility. I don't know, I'm just a humble servant of God, but I wouldn't do that if I were you. Ever heard somebody say that? It's like, ooh, I feel a little guilty over doing that now. Doesn't say it anywhere, but I better not do it because, well, he's not doing it. When people make up rules, they like to make them sound reasonable. And Paul says, be careful about that philosophy. Don't be judged. Don't make up rules for other people that God didn't give you. We fear the ghosts and the goblins of the world, but sometimes the scariest things around us are the subtle twists of truth that people try to push on other people. The philosophies, the thinking, the subtle phrases that make what's good seem evil.